Let's begin by anchoring ourselves in something foundational, something that neuroscience and life experience both confirm. The human brain is hardwired to respond to stimulation. We're built to notice movement, to react to sound, to answer when someone calls our name. It's a biological mechanism rooted in survival. But here's the twist, and it's important. In today's world, the stimuli aren't threats to our survival. They're distractions. There are invitations to expend energy on things that do not serve us. And that is precisely why silence, intentional silence, is one of the most powerful tools we have for gaining control over our lives, our focus, and ultimately our identity. Now, when I talk about silence, I don't mean the absence of sound. I mean the strategic decision to disengage from chaos. The conscious decision to stop reacting. You see, every time you respond to a comment that doesn't matter, you reinforce the neural circuitry that says this matters. Every time you let someone's opinion steer your emotion, you reinforce the notion that your emotional state is dependent on external validation. That's not power, that's surrender. And it chips away at the strength of your mind, your attention span, your discipline. When we scan the brain with fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, what we see is that the default mode network, which is the part of your brain associated with internal thoughts, becomes hyperactive when you're not focused. That's when anxiety spikes. That's when self-doubt creeps in. That's when you replay conversations, what someone said on social media, or what someone thinks about you. But here's the most important thing. When you make a deliberate decision to focus inward and stay silent, you begin to shift brain activity from the default mode network to the task-positive network. That's where presence lives. That's where execution happens. Staying silent, especially when you want to speak, is a neurological superpower. It activates your prefrontal cortex, the executive center of your brain. That's the region that controls impulse, judgment, planning. So think about this. Every time you want to lash out, react, argue back, and you don't, you're literally strengthening the part of your brain that gives you control over your behavior in your life. That's not just emotional maturity, that's neural training. And it has compound interest. The real challenge isn't shutting others out. The real challenge is shutting yourself up. That inner voice that wants to argue, that ego that wants to be heard, that craving for attention, that's what you're really silencing. And that's why it's hard, because our biology wants to be acknowledged. Our dopamine system lights up when we're liked, shared, seen. But when you learn to delay that gratification, when you resist the urge to be seen and instead commit to being effective, you're building a neural blueprint for discipline. Now let's look at this through a lens of practical neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change in response to experience. So what happens when you spend day after day reacting to everything around you? You train your brain to be reactive. You wire yourself for distraction, impulsivity, and stress. But if you carve out silence, if you create space between stimulus and response, you rewire your brain for calmness, precision, and strength. That's not theory, that's physiology. And one of the most powerful things you can do is stop responding to every negative stimulus. If someone disrespects you, the ethical response is to defend yourself. But ask yourself, who are you defending yourself for? Are you trying to prove something to them or to yourself? Because the moment you need their recognition to feel whole, you've already lost control. And the science supports this. Studies show that cortisol, the stress hormone, spikes not when people insult us, but when we obsess about the insult. Silence, in that case, is not avoidance. It's a way of protecting your nervous system. It's a method of reclaiming your internal state. Let me tell you something personal. I've sat in rooms where people have misunderstood me, misquoted me, taken my words out of context. And I used to want to clarify everything, to explain myself. But over time, I learned that your silence teaches people how much access they truly have to your emotions. The more you react, the more control you give away. The less you react, the more you rewire your identity toward internal stability. Here's something most people don't talk about. When you speak all the time, when you always need to be heard, your words start to lose value. But when you train yourself to speak only when necessary, when your words are backed by deep thought and clarity, they carry weight. Neuroscience tells us that novelty drives attention. So if you're constantly making noise, your voice becomes background static. But if you're silent until you have something meaningful to say, people notice. And more importantly, you notice. You start to self-regulate. You start to govern your inner world. And here's the biological reward for this. Every time you self-regulate under stress, every time you choose silence instead of reaction, you're reinforcing the neural circuits of resilience. You're strengthening your vagus nerve, which governs your parasympathetic nervous system. That's your body's calm state. So silence isn't passive. It's an active training ground for calmness, discipline, and power. Let's shift gears into the second component, focus. And I'll say something very direct here. The more you focus on others, the more you lose yourself. That's not poetic. It's a neurological fact. Attention is finite. Your brain has a limited capacity for processing information. Every moment you spend analyzing someone else's life, choices, appearance, progress, lifestyle, you're redirecting limited neural resources away from your own growth. You're investing in something you don't own. There's this phenomenon called attentional hijacking. It happens when your brain gets pulled into loops that aren't congruent with your goals. Social media is the most common trigger. You scroll, compare, doubt. Scroll, compare, doubt. Every swipe is a tiny dose of cortisol and dopamine, conflicting neurotransmitters that confuse your nervous system. One gives you a hit of pleasure. The other spikes your stress. Over time, your brain becomes addicted to chaos. And you wonder why you can't concentrate, why you feel drained, why you're uninspired. It's because your attention is fractured. Let me give you a metaphor. Your attention is like sunlight. If you diffuse it, it warms. But if you focus it through a magnifying glass, it burns. That's the power of focused attention. It creates intensity. And that intensity, when directed inward, is transformative. When you stop looking at what everyone else is doing and start turning your gaze inward toward your skills, your body, your mind, your purpose, you ignite change. Now, neuroscience gives us something called goal-directed behavior. It's governed by the anterior cingulate cortex and the prefrontal cortex. These regions help you stay on track. They help you filter out distractions and move toward a goal. But here's the key. They only get stronger with deliberate practice. If you're constantly distracted, constantly comparing, constantly absorbing other people's energy, those regions don't get activated. You're not training the circuitry of ambition. You're training the circuitry of avoidance. And the reality is, most people don't want to focus on themselves because it forces them to confront where they are. It forces them to face their gaps, their mistakes, their limitations. It's easier to observe someone else's journey than to construct your own. But let me be clear. Avoidance is a silent killer. It doesn't destroy you instantly. It dissolves your potential one distracted day at a time. If you truly want to become the architect of your life, you need to develop a ruthless commitment to focus. And that begins by cutting off the mental parasites, those tiny thoughts about what others are doing, what others are thinking, what others have. Replace those thoughts with questions that spark action. What can I build today? What can I learn? What can I heal? What can I strengthen? These are questions that activate growth circuitry in the brain. And one of the most effective ways to enhance this focus is through controlled exposure to silence. Not just auditory silence, but informational silence. Shut down the noise. Take 30 minutes every day with no input, no podcast, no phone, no scrolling, just you and your thoughts. You'll be amazed at what surfaces. You begin to hear your intuition again. You begin to think in full sentences. You begin to strategize instead of react. That's the birthplace of vision. And I want to emphasize something crucial. Focus isn't natural anymore. In a world engineered to fracture your attention, sustained focus is a rebellion. It's a discipline. And every time you practice it, you get better. You build neural myelination around the focus pathways. You literally make it easier and faster for your brain to lock in. That's how mastery is formed. So here's what I'll leave you with for now, not as advice, but as a protocol. Start by eliminating one source of distraction per day. One. It could be a toxic conversation, a pointless app, a gossip loop, an insecurity you keep feeding. Replace it with 5 minutes of solitude, just 5. And in that 5 minutes, ask yourself one question. What would I do right now if I was fully focused on building myself? Then do it. It doesn't have to be big. Could be stretching, could be journaling, could be making a plan, but do it. That's how neuroplasticity works. It doesn't care how small the behavior is. It only cares that it's repeated. And remember, focus and silence are not passive traits. They're active skills. They're earned. They're built in the trenches of discomfort, self-restraint, and deliberate choice. The more you practice, the more you hardwire a mind that cannot be shaken by noise, distracted by nonsense, or derailed by drama. One of the greatest transformations a human being can undergo happens not when they're surrounded by people, not when they're performing or being acknowledged, but when they're alone, deliberately alone. I want to make this very clear from a neuroscientific standpoint. Isolation is not the same as loneliness. Loneliness is a painful emotional state that comes from a perceived lack of connection. But isolation, intentional solitude, is a cognitive and physiological training ground. It's in those moments of silence, free from the influence of others, that the brain recalibrates. It starts to sort what's real from what's noise. And that's where transformation begins. When you strip away the inputs, the opinions, the expectations, the endless stimuli, you create a clean environment for neuroplasticity. You're no longer reacting, you're initiating. You're no longer being pulled outward, you're turning inward. And this is incredibly important. Your brain is constantly adapting to the environment you expose it to. If you're always surrounded by people telling you who you are, what you should want, what you should fear, you begin to outsource your identity. You become a mirror of the world instead of a builder of the self. But when you step away, when you isolate, you take control of the input. And what controls the input controls the output. Let's go deeper. When you choose to be alone, not in suffering, but in training, you activate deep rest states in the brain. These states are necessary for reflection, consolidation, and insight. Think of it this way. Your brain is like a high-performance computer, but even the fastest processors need downtime to run background processes. That's what solitude provides. It allows your subconscious mind to sort, file, and connect information. It's in that space that new insights emerge, solutions, ideas, clarity. But most people never get there because they're never quiet long enough to hear their own minds. And here's what's fascinating. Solitude also reduces social comparison. You're not watching others. You're not being watched. You're simply being. And in that state, your dopamine system resets. You start to get pleasure from effort again. You find joy in creation again. You start to build a relationship with yourself that isn't based on achievement, performance, or perception, but on presence. And that is the most stable kind of self-confidence there is. Now, the science also tells us that the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for planning, emotional regulation, and self-awareness, actually becomes more active during intentional solitude. So the time you spend alone isn't wasted. This is the time when your highest brain functions come online. It's when you start asking better questions. Who am I becoming? What actually matters to me? Where am I sabotaging myself? These are not easy questions, but they're necessary. And you don't find them in the noise, you find them in the stillness. But here's the friction point. When you isolate for growth, you're going to face discomfort. Your nervous system is going to rebel. It's going to tell you to check your phone, to reach out, to distract yourself. That's not weakness. It's the dopamine withdrawal talking. It's the reward system of your brain adjusting to a new baseline. Most people quit in that moment. But the ones who stay in the silence, who stay in the discomfort, who breathe through it and remain aware, they're the ones who transform. So here's what I encourage you to do. Engineer isolation, not as punishment, but as a protocol. Build time into your day where you are unavailable mentally, emotionally, physically, not to punish the world, but to purify your attention. Create space where the only influence is your inner voice, your inner vision. That's where your future self is formed, because when you come out of that state, when you re-engage with the world, you do it from a position of strength, clarity, and direction. Let's talk about energy now. And when I say energy, I don't mean it in a mystical or vague sense. I mean it in terms of biochemistry. The brain operates on glucose and oxygen. The nervous system is regulated by the balance of sympathetic and parasympathetic activity. The body functions through cycles of stress and recovery. That's energy, and it's not infinite. Every decision you make, every emotion you process, every conflict you engage costs energy. So the question becomes, where are you spending your energy? And more importantly, where are you wasting it? There's a truth that most people never confront. Your energy is more valuable than your time. You can have all the time in the world, but if your energy is low, your output is zero. Your creativity dies, your discipline fades, your ambition dissolves. So protecting your energy is not a luxury, it's a requirement for growth. And that protection starts with silence, strategic silence, emotional silence, psychological silence, not reacting to everything, not engaging every opinion, not fighting every battle. Here's the neuroscience behind this. When you engage in conflict, verbal, emotional, even imagined, your amygdala becomes active. That's the threat detection center of your brain. It prepares you for fight or flight. Your cortisol rises, your heart rate increases, your digestion slows. Your focus narrows. That's useful if you're in a survival situation. But if you're doing that 20 times a day because someone looked at you wrong or posted something you didn't like or said something about you, you are literally frying your nervous system. You are spending energy that you don't have to give. But when you stay silent, when you train yourself not to respond, you prevent the activation of that stress loop. You conserve energy, and you can redirect that energy into something that builds you, your body, your skills, your work, your vision. That's not avoidance, that's strategic living. There's another layer to this. Every person you interact with has an emotional signature. Some people regulate your nervous system. They calm you, they support you. Others dysregulate your system. They drain you, they confuse you, they provoke you. And the more time you spend around the latter, the more you expose yourself to energetic friction, the more you normalize stress. You begin to think that being tense, reactive, and overwhelmed is just how life is, but it's not. It's how your inputs are. Change the input, change the output. You have to start viewing your attention and energy like a limited budget. And just like with money, not every expense is worth it. Not every person deserves access. Not every problem deserves a reaction. You must develop a kind of internal audit. Ask yourself, is this interaction aligned with my values? Is this conversation feeding my purpose? Is this argument worth my mental clarity? Most of the time, the answer will be no. And silence will be your most intelligent response. I want to bring this into your body now, because your nervous system is
not just in your brain, it's distributed throughout your entire physiology. And when you're constantly reactive, you create muscular tension, disrupted breathing patterns, poor digestion, insomnia. You begin to live in a low-grade fight or flight state that wears down your immune system. It affects your hormones. It lowers your threshold for stress. So this isn't just about focus, it's about health. Silence, on the other hand, activates the parasympathetic system. That's your rest and digest mode. When you stay silent, when you breathe deeply, when you pull your energy back from unnecessary drama, you downshift your nervous system. You allow your body to repair, your brain to integrate, your hormones to balance. That's not weakness, that's elite performance management. And here's something else to consider. The people who demand your attention the most are often the ones who contribute the least to your growth. You have to be ruthless with this. Not cruel, not angry, just firm. Not everyone gets access. Not every notification gets answered. Not every invitation gets accepted, because every yes to them is a no to you. And if you keep saying no to yourself, eventually your life becomes a reaction, not a creation. So what do? You build boundaries, but not just physical ones. Neurological ones, you train your brain to pause before it reacts. You install a moment of stillness between stimulus and response. That pause, that microsecond of silence is where your power lives. It's where choice exists. And that choice determines everything. This is the discipline of modern life, choosing where your energy goes, not being dragged into every conflict, not being baited into emotional chaos, not leaking your power through endless explanation, validation, confrontation. There is a strength that comes from silence that no noise can match. If you start applying this, if you start filtering your inputs, auditing your responses, and training your nervous system for silence and focus, you will notice a shift, not just in how others see you, but in how you see yourself. You'll move from reactive to strategic, from drained to charged, from scattered to precise, and that is the mindset required to build a powerful life.